Times were tough for the family. The husband, with a proud flourish, submitted his resignation to his boss. He then declared to his wife, "Your $70,000 will be more than enough for the two of us if we cut out the excesses. Why do we need all these yogurts and manicures?" The woman silently accepted the new rules of engagement and began to economize on everything. But a true test awaited them on Sunday, when the mother-in-law, following tradition, brought her daughter and 3 children for a complimentary lunch. Hello, dear listeners. I'm delighted to welcome you to my channel. I'm presenting a new and engaging story for you. Enjoy listening. Alina had grown accustomed to the notion that money in their household was her money. The $70,000 per month she earned as an executive assistant at a large construction firm felt like a modest but reliable sum. They rented an apartment for $22,000 on the outskirts, with utilities adding another $5,000. Groceries consumed approximately $20,000, considering Alina's fondness for decent meat, fresh vegetables, and morning yogurts. This left room for clothing, cosmetics, and occasional outings to the cinema or a cafe. They lived comfortably, without denying themselves small pleasures. Vadim worked as a sales manager at a logistics company. His salary was variable, sometimes bringing in $40,000, sometimes $50,000 if he met his sales targets. This income covered his personal expenses, his car, fuel, and occasional assistance to his mother. Alina didn't consider this money communal. Vadim managed his earnings as he saw fit, and she managed hers. This seemed fair. Until that particular Monday when Vadim returned home at 3 in the afternoon, his eyes alight with a strange fervor, announcing he had quit his job. Quit? How? Alina froze, a bag of groceries in her hands. She had just walked in, still in her heels. "I wrote my resignation and left," Vadim said, removing his jacket and tossing it onto the sofa. "I was fed up. The boss is a tyrant. They set impossible targets and cut bonuses. I can't take it anymore." "Vadim, our rent is due in a week. We have a loan for the refrigerator. Did you even think about this?" "I did." He turned to her, a new, stubbornly calm expression in his eyes. "Your $70,000 will be enough for both of us if we cut out the excesses." Alina placed the grocery bag on the table slowly. "What excesses?" "Well, these." He nodded towards her bag. "Yogurt every day, manicures every 2 weeks, coffee from the vending machine at work. All that can be eliminated, and we'll live decently until I find something worthwhile." Alina was speechless. She stared at her husband, at his contented face, at his relaxed posture, and couldn't believe he was serious. Alina felt a hot surge begin to build within her. Quote 12. Quote 13. Alina exhaled slowly. She remembered her mother-in-law complaining a month ago that Vadim had been helping out with money less frequently. She recalled him saying he was tired of his job, that he wanted to find something of his own. And here it was, his quote 14 sitting at home, leeching off her. Quote 15, she asked quietly. Quote 16, quote 17, quote 18, quote 19. 3 months relying solely on her salary, without his $40,000, which had served as their financial cushion. Alina turned and went to the kitchen, beginning to unpack the groceries. Yogurts into the refrigerator, bread into the bread box, vegetables into the crisper. She did everything in silence, feeling a heavy lump of resentment grow inside her. She hadn't asked him to quit, hadn't asked him to become a dependent, and she certainly wasn't going to give up her manicures and decent food for his pride. The first week passed in strained silence. Alina continued to buy the same groceries and frequent the same places. Vadim demonstratively examined the receipts and sighed. One evening, he reached into her purse and pulled out a small receipt from a beauty salon. Nails. Seriously? My money. Alina snatched the receipt back. I earned it. Now it's our money, Vadim stated, crossing his arms over his chest. You're supporting the family, which means expenses should be reasonable. Reasonable? Alina felt her patience snap like an overstretched rubber band. It was reasonable not to quit without savings. It was reasonable to discuss this with me. Instead, you just came home and announced that I'll be feeding you pasta from now on. Don't yell, I'm looking for a job. Where? On the sofa? Are you even looking at job postings? I am, but they're all trivial. Low salaries, poor conditions. Alina couldn't take it anymore and went into the bathroom. She locked the door and gave herself 5 minutes for a quiet breakdown. Then she washed her face with cold water, looked at herself in the mirror, and thought that living like this was impossible. But how to live, she didn't yet understand. By the end of the second week, problems began to arise. They managed to pay the rent, but afterward, only $48,000 remained in their account until the next payday. Alina started counting every ruble, gave up taxis, traveled by metro, and stopped buying pre-made salads during her lunch break, opting instead for containers of homemade food. She did keep the yogurts, but the cheapest ones, in large, family-sized packs. Her manicure appointments were postponed. Vadim noticed this and perked up. See, you can do it when you want to. Now we're living normally. Normally, Alina thought, meant constantly wondering if she'd have enough for her monthly metro pass, while Vadim calmly ordered himself a 600-ruble pizza on a Friday evening, quote 31. She couldn't help but exclaim, "We're supposed to be saving. I've eaten your buckwheat with chicken all week. Can't I treat myself just once? So, with my money, it's acceptable?" Vadim winced but finished his pizza. In the third week, Alina learned that guests were coming over on Sunday. She found out by accident. Vadim let it slip during dinner. "Mom's coming over with Dasha and the kids on Sunday." Alina froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Coming over how? Well, it's tradition. They come for lunch every Sunday. Every Sunday. Previously, Alina would host Vadim's family once a month, preparing something substantial like a pie and fruits. The children would devour everything. Dasha would stuff bags with leftovers. The mother-in-law, Jana Olegovna, would critique the borscht or the arrangement of the plates. But that was when they had 2 incomes. Quote 38, quote 39, quote 40. She pulled out her phone, opening the notes where she had meticulously recorded expenses for the past 2 weeks. Vadim waved it away, quote 41. But Alina knew very well that Jana Olegovna was quite picky, and Dashka and the children were too. The elder boy, 7-year-old Artyom, ate only cutlets and fries. The middle child, 5-year-old Kira, wouldn't eat anything with onions. The youngest, 3-year-old Makar, could throw a tantrum if something in his bowl wasn't to his liking. Meanwhile, Dasha would calmly sit and complain that she couldn't cope with the children, that she was tired, and therefore indulged them. "I'm not feeding them," Alina stated firmly. "If you want to invite them, cook yourself." Vadim looked at her as if she had suggested throwing his mother out the window. "What are you talking about? Alina, this is my family. This is my money, which is barely enough for us. One lunch won't bankrupt us." "It will. I calculated that we have 10 days until payday and 21,000 rubles. That's 700 rubles a day for everything. One lunch for 5 people is a minimum of 3,000. 3 days without money." Vadim stood up from the table, throwing down his napkin. "You know what? You've become insolent. You work. And so what? That gives you the right to tell me who to invite into our home." "Into a rented apartment," Alina corrected coldly, "which I am paying for." She was startled by her own words, but they had already escaped. Vadim clenched his jaw and left the kitchen, slamming the door. Alina remained seated at the table, staring at her half-eaten buckwheat. Everything inside her clenched with resentment and anger towards Vadim, towards his mother, towards the situation. She wanted to run away, rent a room by herself, move back in with her parents, anything to avoid carrying the burden of a husband who proudly sat unemployed, and his relatives who were accustomed to dropping in and eating heartily. But she didn't run. She simply went to bed in the same bed, turned her back to Vadim, and listened to his heavy, resentful breathing until morning. On Saturday, Vadim announced that his mother would indeed be coming the next day. Alina didn't respond. She simply opened the refrigerator, looked at the meager supplies, 1/2 kilogram of chicken, some vegetables, eggs, pasta, and closed the door. "Let her come," she said calmly, "but I'll feed them what we have, and that's it." Sunday morning, she woke up early, boiled chicken broth, made a simple vegetable salad, and boiled pasta. Everything was modest, minimal. No pies, no extravagance. Stale bread, butter, tea. Vadim paced the apartment, peeking into the kitchen and grimacing. "Maybe you could make some cutlets. Artyom won't eat without cutlets." "With what?" Alina didn't even turn around. Quote 53, quote 54. Vadim fell silent. Zhana Olegovna arrived precisely at 1 o'clock. Tall, with prominent features, she entered like royalty, leading Dasha, a pale, weary woman of about 30, and 3 noisy children. Artyom immediately rushed to the television. Kira climbed onto the sofa. Makar wailed in Alina's kitchen, demanding juice. Alina placed a pot of soup on the table. Makar tilted his chin, ready to cry. Quote 58. Jana Olegovna walked into the kitchen, surveyed the table, and pursed her lips. Dasha calmly settled into a chair. Jana Olegovna turned to Alina. Alina placed plates on the table. Quote 63. The mother-in-law stretched her neck like a goose. Quote 64. Silence fell. Makar looked at his grandmother, then at Alina, and not getting his juice, finally burst into tears. Dasha weakly tried to calm him. Jana Olegovna gave Alina a heavy look. Quote 65, she called. Quote 66. Vadim emerged from the room looking guilty and tense. Quote 67, quote 68, quote 69. Vadim looked at her tiredly. Quote 70, quote 71. She poured soup into the plates. Quote 72. Jana Olegovna stared incredulously at the plate of broth in which modest pieces of chicken and carrot floated. Quote 73, quote 74, quote 75. The words were spoken quietly, but everyone heard them. Dasha raised her eyes. Vadim blushed. Jana Olegovna stiffened like a string. The mother-in-law turned to her son, her voice filled with genuine indignation. Quote 78, quote 79. Vadim sat down at the table, not looking at anyone. Quote 80. But Jana Olegovna was just getting started. Quote 81. Quote 82. Alina held herself together with all her might, feeling the boiling anger inside. Jana Olegovna threw her hands up. Alina corrected calmly. Quote 87. Dasha fidgeted and averted her gaze. The children quieted, sensing the tension. Jana Olegovna's face turned red. "So, are we family or strangers to you?" Jana Olegovna. Alina put down the ladle and looked her mother-in-law in the eye. "If you care so much about the children, perhaps you could help them with money or groceries for once." Jana Olegovna opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Then she stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back. "Everything is clear, Vadim. I will not stay in a house where I'm being shown the door." "Mom, wait." Vadim jumped up, but his mother was already heading for the exit. "Dasha, children, let's go. We're not welcome here." Dasha shot Alina a guilty glance, scooped Makar into her arms, and called to the older children. Artyom grudgingly slid off the sofa. Kira whined. A few minutes later, the entire entourage had vacated the apartment, and the front door slammed shut. Vadim remained standing in the middle of the kitchen, pale and bewildered. "Are you happy now?" he asked hoarsely. "No." Alina sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "I'm just tired." "You threw out my mother and sister and the children." "I told the truth. We can't feed them. You wanted to save money yourself." "But not at the expense of family. And at the expense of whom?" "At my expense. At the expense of my yogurts and manicures." Vadim clenched his fists, turned, and left the kitchen. Alina then heard him putting on his coat and the sound of the door slamming. He had evidently gone after his mother. She was left alone. She sat at the table, staring at the pot of soup at the untouched plates, and suddenly felt that she could no longer hold back. Tears flowed freely from resentment, from exhaustion, from the absurdity her life had become. She worked, earned money, tried to keep the family afloat, and in return received reproaches and accusations. Alina picked up her phone and called her mother. "Mom, can I come over?" "What's wrong, my darling?" "I'll tell you later. Can I just come?" "Of course, darling, come over." Alina packed a bag, took her documents, phone, charger, threw on a jacket, and left. She closed the door quietly without hysterics, simply shut it behind her and went downstairs. Her mother lived in the next neighborhood, in a small one-room apartment inherited from her grandmother. She met Alina at the door, hugged her tightly, seated her in the kitchen, and made tea. "Tell me everything." And Alina recounted everything. Vadim's resignation, the economizing, the mother-in-law and lunch, the yogurts and manicures. Her mother listened in silence, only occasionally grimacing. Quote, 104, she said when Alina finished. Quote, 105. The question caught Alina off guard. She pondered if she loved Vadim. Before, yes, when they were first dating, when he was attentive and caring, when they laughed together and made plans. But now she saw before her a man who had shifted all responsibility onto her shoulders and who was offended that she couldn't single-handedly support his family. "I don't know, Mom." "Then stay here for a while. Think it over. Sort things out." Alina stayed. She slept on a folding bed in her mother's room, went to work, and returned. Vadim called the next day. Alina didn't answer. He texted her on Messenger. "Where are you, Alina? What's going on?" She didn't reply. Another day passed and he called 10 times in a row. Alina finally picked up. Quote, 109, she asked wearily. Quote, 110. Quote, 111. Quote, 112. Quote, 113. Alina gave a bitter chuckle. A pause. She hung up. A week passed. Alina received her salary and transferred 22,000 rubles to Vadim for the rent, to avoid being in debt. She kept the rest for herself. She bought herself proper groceries, yogurts, and went for a manicure. For the first time in a month, she felt she could breathe freely. Vadim texted every day, initially with accusations that she had abandoned him, that it was wrong, that this wasn't how families were built. Then, more gently, that he missed her, that he wanted to fix everything. Later, he sent a photo from a job interview. "I have a meeting with the employer tomorrow. They're promising 45,000. Alina read it and didn't reply. She no longer cared. Then Jana Olegovna called. Alina almost hung up, but curiosity prevailed, and she hung up. Alina sat with the phone in her hand, not understanding why she needed to do this, but on Saturday she went anyway. Partly out of politeness, partly out of that same curiosity. Her mother-in-law's apartment was in an old 5-story building. Jana Olegovna opened the door, nodded curtly, and led her into the living room. Vadim and Dasha were already seated at the table. Dasha's eyes were red. Quote, 124. The mother-in-law indicated a chair. Alina sat, feeling as if she were in court. Jana Olegovna sat at the head of the table, folded her hands, and began. Quote, 125. Alina remained silent. Vadim stared at the table. Quote, 126. The mother-in-law spoke as if issuing a decree. Quote, 127. Quote, 128. Alina asked quietly. Quote, 129. Jana Olegovna pursed her lips. Quote, 130. Quote, 131. Quote, 132. Alina looked at her mother-in-law, then at Vadim, then at Dasha, who sat with her face buried in a napkin, and suddenly realized that nothing would ever change. Jana Olegovna would demand sacrifices. Vadim would forever search for work. Dasha would come for free lunches with the children, and Alina would carry them all until she completely broke. No. She stood up. Quote, 133. Quote, 134. Vadim jumped up. Quote, 135. Quote, 136. She turned and left. Behind her, She heard Jana Olegovna shout and the slam of the door, but Alina was already descending the stairs, feeling lighter with every step. The divorce was finalized 2 months later by mutual consent, without division of property. Vadim didn't resist, evidently realizing the seriousness of the situation. Alina later learned that he had indeed found a job, but his salary was indeed modest. She rented a small studio apartment, furnished it to her taste, hung light curtains, bought a soft throw, placed flowers on the windowsill, drank coffee with yogurt every morning, went for manicures every 2 weeks, and saved money not for other people's lunches, but for her own vacation. One day, almost a year after the divorce, Alina was walking through a shopping mall and saw a familiar figure near a children's clothing store, Dasha. She stood with a stroller, apparently having had her 4th child, rummaging through a sale bin. The older children milled around her. Artyom tugged at his mother's sleeve, demanding a toy. Dasha looked even more exhausted than a year ago. Elena was about to walk past, but Dasha raised her head, and their eyes met. Then Dasha gave a weak smile and nodded. Alina nodded back and walked on without looking back.